Today we have Jeremy Grishop, a software developer at Omnibond, here to talk about the adaptive framework, AFW. I'm so excited to meet you. Jeremy, what is your current role?
I've been with Omnibond for 24 years, probably starting back in 2001. And we were kind of a much different company back then. We sort of worked on what's called identity management solutions. Back then, we had a contract with a vendor called Novell at the time, which has been transformed to other companies along the way. But that was sort of our roots, was working on software that we could use at the university and that software would then be marketed and sold by Novell, and a symbiotic relationship there where we get to be a part of the solutions that we used at the university. So that was kind of cool. And then, my roles sort of evolved as Omnibond's roles have kind of changed. They've kind of gone into the HPC space and high performance parallel file systems and traffic vision and, all sorts of stuff, even into this most recent foray into projectEUREKA, which I know you've talked a lot about. So, but for me, it's been mostly about software. It's always been about writing code and engineering solutions.
What is a FW?
I actually worked with a colleague who's retired now, Mike Gossett. He was really big into compilers and operating systems. And so he loved the nuts and bolts of why things work. And if you asked him when AFW started, he would have told you back in the 1970s, because a lot of the concepts that he used with mainframes, he brought forward into this framework and the design of it. A lot of it really came about when we were doing identity management implementations at Clemson University. Now, identity management is such a broad concept, and depending on who you ask, you probably get different responses about what that really means to them. What I'm talking about is sort of the management of the life cycle of identities from when you become onboarded into a new organization to how your role changes there, and then finally when you leave or exit that organization. And, the resources that you get when you get onboarded, having access to different applications and systems, and how that changes across your career. When an organization takes on an identity management solution, they obviously have so many different backend systems that need to be aware of your identity. You got to be able to integrate different aspects of who you are and what you have access to, and throughout all those backend systems. So identity management solutions can be very large, very broad, and, they reach a space that's, horizontally, they can target financial systems to telecom companies to universities, obviously. And so the solutions that they put forth in the software have to meet a lot of these broad goals. And then, of course, then you got the vertical structure where you got anything from a very small private school to a very large international telecom industry. So oftentimes what you get with a solution that is in this identity management space, it doesn't always cover all the bases. And so there's a lot of what we had to do at the university is we had to implement a lot of these last mile sort of solutions for the identity management product that we had in place. So, and just like you buy any sort of software, you're going to end up having to customize it, doing the compiler inside of adaptive framework and the scripting language and everything. We got to kind of look at other languages and kind of say, hey, what's popular right now? What's going to kind of attract people to be able to use our scripting language? And we looked at stuff like Python and JavaScript, and we kind of settled on a very JavaScript-like syntax for doing our language. You're going to end up having to add tools to it to make certain things easier for your users. And so when we did this with our identity management solution, we kept adding more and more stuff to this and customizing it. And we started to think, why don't we actually just turn this into a product itself, as this framework? And it sort of abstracts the original solution and then allows you to sort of like plug and play and put different backends that you can include and exclude. So like if your organization is using a vendor solution for a particular backend system, and then you want to replace it later because, all of a sudden they've changed licensing costs, or it's just become too difficult to maintain or they've gone out of business. But you need to be able to be adaptive and account for that. So you need to be able to swap out some sort of backend system with another one and have all the rest of your tools to sort of stay the same. So you're not like completely wiping everything out and starting over again. And so we need to be able to like connect to multiple backends and just plug in real easily. And then we also want it to be very extendable. So, when you get something in place, this whole framework, a lot of it was written, the core, the kernel of it's written in C. And it's got a history for why we chose to go that route. But the idea was that nobody would ever have to go in and change a lot of this kernel stuff. So you would have these extensions you could put on top, and then you have like policy layers and then an entire scripting language that can kind of do a lot of the heavy lifting for customers that would need to extend this to do things that we didn't do in our implementation. Yeah, I think if you're in the game of using AFW, you're already working on a software project that's involved multiple systems that are going to be talking to each other. You're probably talking about, you're building out a system that needs to have a backend object store. And so that's part of what makes adaptive framework kind of cool, is like it's got a pluggable way to persist data and a way to access that data, a way to control the authorization around the access of that data, ways to transform that data. So if you're using adaptive framework, you already know that you need to be able to store and fetch out data in some way. And you probably know that you're going to be able to connect this, that you want to have other systems to be able to access it. So adaptive framework is not an app you put on your phone and use it for something. It really is a toolkit to allow you to design how systems, persist and present and access data. This is, to me, it's felt like a giant computer science project. Like, so you could have been working on this for your entire undergraduate and graduate career and came out with a pretty cool project out of this. It's been really fun. It's been really fun to work on.
Its core is C. And then the scripting side is more of it's not JavaScript, but it's the same syntax.
Yeah, there's some subtle differences, but there's actually a lot of JavaScript features were mostly ECMAScript compliant. And a lot of that was really useful because it allowed us to actually borrow the conformance test for JavaScript and run them against our adaptive script, which is the scripting language we created. Yeah. So we could actually just not have to come up with our entire test suite to enforce our entire language. We could just borrow their conformance tests and run them against our compiler and make sure things pass. So that was kind of a nice little utilization of other code. We're all about using other people's code. It's, even though it's written in C, it relies on things like ICU for internationalization, Apache libraries for doing a lot of like memory pool management, stuff like that. When somebody's done something really, really well, there's no reason to reinvent the wheel in those cases.
Yeah, I happen to know that the GitHub repository was initiated about 2 years ago. What would you say was kind of that alpha code, that code base that you could say this is version 1?
Well, that's the thing. We still don't have a version 1 at this point in time. It's been in alpha for a while, and I'm not sure when. It seems like anytime we published a main so that you can go to the repo and see it. And, by comparison to a lot of other projects, it might look like it is highly polished and looks like a 1.0 at least. But, we're still kind of changing things a lot. And we didn't want to put something out there and have it completely broken or not backwards compatible with some significant changes that we kind of saw on the horizon. So in that way, yeah, it's still kind of alpha at this point. Hoping after the project Eureka is finished with it, it'll be a lot more stable. And at that point, we can go back, and there's a lot of things with cookbooks and getting intro guides, user content that we need to put in place. I think it'll make it easier to be adopted
with other organizations.
The big part of this whole framework that I probably forgot to mention that it was a big motivation for doing this was also we wanted something that was going to be open source. So many vendor solutions in that identity space were, the licensing is cost prohibitive for a lot of people to get certain solutions in place to begin with. If you're a small private school, you're probably not going to be able to afford half of what's on the market. And so open source solutions kind of make sense for that. But also if you're getting into use within the government or something, you want to use something they can see. It's not a black box. So there's just a lot of upside to having an open source project. It was mostly internal for a long time. And part of that was just getting, a lot of the work that was done by Clemson University was on their time. So there was a lot of time spent trying to figure out how we could open source it and to get the right people in place. After that, a lot of its use had been used with Omnibond. Omnibond used it for a pillar of their technology stack. That's heavily influenced the direction and what emphasis we would spend time working on adaptive framework. So, it's nice to be able to have the freedom to kind of like, be creative with doing these kind of projects. But when you really have some strong use cases, that's when you realize, you know what, this is actually really significant and we need to get better at this, or we need to focus more time on this. So it's been good to kind of oscillate back and forth. So a lot of the influence and the direction, because prior to that, if I step back a little bit, prior to that, a lot of it was just, for a long time, it was me and Mike working on this. And we could get a lot done, but sure would have been nice if we had an entire team of developers to do it. And so a lot of it was done sort of in our imagination of what we think people are going to be using it for. We do have a GitHub repository, some resources out there like a Discord channel to communicate what's going on with adaptive framework. After it became open source,
is that kind of the call to action? If you have these thousands of open source people, chanting, we want to help, would you look at them and go, we need documentation?
Yeah, documentation. You only get one chance at a first impression. And it's really, really hard from my perspective, when you're already in the nuts and bolts of everything, to kind of look back and say, wow, you know what, this really needs work. And so getting fresh faces to look at it and just say, hey, I don't understand this, or why did you make this so complicated, or how can you make this simpler? Those are the kind of things. And documentation is definitely on the top of the list for that. But, we've had a wish list of stuff, being able to integrate it more directly with the VS Code extensions. There's features that GitHub has that I would love to be able to have those in place to work better with spinning up containers in the cloud and using framework that way, so that people can actually just jump right in and not really have to say, all right, you need to download and install this, and this before you even get started. And people are a little overwhelmed by the technology requirements for those things. So.
Well, I can't let you step on that, because there are Docker images available, both developmental and production. That's got to make it at least a little bit easier.
Yeah. Before Docker, trying to run this framework was something you really needed to have me or Mike to kind of show you the ropes. You got to get your system set up like this. Docker really changed the game for me, knowing that when you have a framework like adaptive framework that has so many little dependencies in place, being able to curate a container that has exactly what you want, pinned to the exact versions that you need, really makes for this experience that you're going to have identical to everyone else that's going to use it. And if they have a problem, it's easily reproducible. You can figure out what's wrong too. So that's been really cool. I think the way that GitHub has gone with Docker and their dev environments through the cloud, where you can just kind of like go right to a project and get right into a VS Code editor right there in the web page and have it launch a container in the cloud. And that's just like sort of next level stuff that I've only kind of scratched the surface on. But to me, I think that's kind of the future of collaboration on a large scale, or be able to get people that don't want to invest in jumping into a new, software technology.
Being able to get into the developmental environment within GitHub and spin up the Docker containers
Yeah.
would be great, but then amplifying that with something like GitOps, wherein the purpose of it for identity management and making the connections between these different services could actually be a part of your software as a service stack.
Yeah.
I definitely see how that will work.
Especially, what I see is like the adaptive framework itself is this part that kind of sits behind things that you can then build on top of. And so, I'd really hoped that at some point you'd have different products that could come out and you would be using adaptive framework and probably not even know that you're using it because you're using something else that's built on top of it. And it's just sort of there in the background.
Well, I mean, that's the best kind of software, right?
Yeah,
The software that just does what it needs to do.
that's right.
How is AFW used in Project Eureka?
Yeah. So, those requirements have changed over the past year as well. But some of the things that it's being used for, that it continues to be used for, is persisting objects. And one of the really cool things about adaptive framework, because you can like swap out the backend, that's made it useful for Project Eureka, is you could start by saying, I want a simple like file object store backend. So when you're like doing all your Project Eureka development and you're writing out object data, you can actually just go into the file system and cat the file, and like see what its contents are and make sure it's right. And it's easy to back it up. You just copy the file somewhere. You want to commit those to GitHub, you could do that. It's easy to prime data for demos and things like that. So development wise, adaptive framework was really, really useful in that regards. And then the other things that's using it for is authorization. Project Eureka has lots of different kinds of users. They have like auditors, administrators, end users, and they all have different ways that they interact with the project data on the back end. And so what an end user has access to is different from what an administrator has access to. And so they needed to have like a way to define clearly what all the rules were. And one of the parts that adaptive framework does really well is it has like a policy engine where you can just using adaptive script, you can actually write policy to enforce, who has access to what. It's the authorization system in adaptive framework was actually modeled off of something called XACML, which I don't know if you've ever heard of, but it's like extensible access control model language. The idea was when you try to authorize somebody for whether they have permissions to do something, you're answering an authorization question of who, does this subject have access to this resource in this environment? And as long as you can define those nouns, the object, the subject, the resource, the access, the environment, then it's really easy to kind of set up like authorization policy around how you pull out the attributes that define those particular nouns and write your policy language to be able to enforce that. The object, the subject, the resource, the access, the environment. It's also kind of a delegated system. So you don't have like one entity in control of all the authorization. You can say, for these resources, it's delegated to this other department and they have their own policy. So in that way, Omnibond has sort of used this authorization scheme to be able to do a lot of their auth calls around in Project Eureka. And then the other thing that it's being used for is data mapping and transformation roles. So you get data pulled in from different sources. And one of the really cool things that they're doing is taking cloud APIs, things like Kubernetes or AWS, Google Cloud, and taking all of the data that you could interact with out of those cloud providers and generating adaptive script library bindings around those so that you can call directly into cloud providers to get data out. So if you need to make a decision, an authorization decision, and part of that decision requires you to have to go poke around Google Cloud for something, you could just call these functions out of adaptive script and go and do that. And then the other thing you can do is you can actually build web apps that pull that information down and then allow it to be consumed by a user. That's a lot easier than having to go directly to a console and know how to use a particular cloud console. So there's a lot of cool directions that they're going with the data access layer.
And especially concerning the fact that every cloud provider is different. And then Kubernetes for on-prem, everything is different. So having all the background communications and things as far as with the APIs and whatnot done in their particular way and syntax and things, but it doesn't matter as far as on the developmental side, I guess the middleware side. You can use the same AFW commands and it takes all the backend stuff's already taken care of.
Exactly. Yeah. It streams them through a common interface.
Right.
Everything you get is an adaptive object. And so whether it came from AWS or Google or Kubernetes, it's going to surface on the other side as an adaptive object. And, those objects have a highly customizable schema, and you can change the schema on the fly.
Mm-hmm.
Which, one of the things that we always really struggled with using LDAP based backends for a lot of object stores is that managing the schema can be kind of a chore. A lot of times it's like written in stone, like you make sure that these things are case ignore strings and that's it. And so then you started seeing people sort of say, you know what, let's just make everything strings. And then you won't ever have to change it later on, or make sure it's multi-valued in case you might need it to be multi-valued. With Adaptive Framework, you could actually just go and change the data model and say, hey, make this, and voila, there's no enforcement that's going to break. It's very adaptive in that way.
Of course, AFW is being used in projectEUREKA in particular, but taking you to a world where your imagination becomes real. In the HPC field, in the HPC community, how could you see them using AFW in a broader sense?
I think I'd go back to the idea of using systems that are built on top of Adaptive Framework itself. And, I think what you're talking about is maybe in a case of a self-service tool that somebody like a professor would use, they know what they need, but they don't exactly know all of the little parts that are going to be required to do that. And, even if you step back and look at like somebody who maintains, a support center for a small school, it's probably overwhelming for them to be able to have to know what technologies they need to put in place to handle their directory accounts, their Unix systems, their file system storage. What they'd like to be able to do is say, I need one of these, click, go through a wizard and have it pop out in the cloud and everything's all just talking to each other and connected. And so if you think from the professor's perspective, they're even like maybe more naive about that. At least the sysadmin knows the kinds of technology they need, but the professor just knows I need to have an HPC, allocated for me at this time. And I'm going to collaborate with these people. And I need to be able to like share these results and analyze this stuff. And then there would be a system that knows how to go out and collect the things that are going to be required for that, build it out, deploy it in the cloud, and then have these resources allocated to the people who are collaborating with that professor on a particular project. So there's a lot of abstraction in between there, but I think what you have is you've got Adaptive Framework at the core, and then you've got something like projectEUREKA that's using it, and it's the interface for the professor or that administrator that knows how to get the things that they need to do that particular HPC task.
So is there a tutorial somewhere for AFW?
Yeah, so we've got a domain called afw.tools that has groups all of our documentation together. And if there is a developer tab in there that kind of has an introduction and ways to contribute. And then it's also got a section for development tools that sort of it steps you through at least like what you need to install to, Docker wise and Visual Studio wise to better get started. From there, then it's about what kind of project you're going to use. Once you get this stuff in place, you've got an Nginx instance, you've got a fast CGI service, and in the administrative app where you can actually just go and open your browser and start going into one of the apps called Fiddle and writing adaptive script code if you wanted to. But it's going to depend on what you want to use the framework for, really, after that.
So here's your last question. And you may want to spit it with a call to action.
All right.
So what's the future roadmap of adaptive frameworks? And what would you like people looking to utilize adaptive frameworks to consider doing, or at least consider a starting point so that then they can add on beyond documentation?
Yeah. Well, yeah, I mean, what's funny is the documentation, one of the things that Mike always emphasized is having this one source of truth and having a lot of stuff just be generated from that. And, you never end up changing multiple places. And the documentation was supposed to kind of fall in line with that. So, there's a lot of docs that we have that are kind of self-maintaining. As long as you've gotten the code right in the adaptive framework and you've updated the right template, then the documentation gets generated and reference is all kind of there. But obviously there's higher level user guide kind of content that's not so easily consumed by automated processes. So, obviously there's work that has to be done there. Tools that will be designed to use adaptive framework, like the GitHub tools. I think VS Code extensions, those kind of IDEs, they're super popular. There's a reason that people jump into using VS Code. It's got a lot of cool features that are really untapped by adaptive framework. You can write extensions that have debuggers in them and stuff. So I always thought it'd be cool that if you wanted to debug your adaptive script both locally and on a server, you could just easily run the extension and have it be able to step through your policy and know whether you wrote it successfully or you've got bugs in it. There's still a lot of tests, unit tests and integration tests that need to be fleshed out. So that's where I'm thinking is people being able to contribute to testing, to development environment, and even kind of finishing up a lot of the loose ends on the built-in administrative web app, or even building more web apps on top of it. That's kind of where I'm hoping to see a lot of work in the future.